Hello, I'm Roger Bailey, and welcome to the first lecture in Module 1 of Managerial Economics for the Specialized Masters in Business Analytics program at the Fisher College of Business. In today's lecture, we're going to discuss how economists predict individual behavior, how we can use that model of individual behavior to frame problems that a manager might face, and how to use wealth creation as a metric for assessing potential solutions to those problems. Let's start off by considering a few situations that a manager might find themselves in. For example, maybe the firm is considering a large R&D investment, or maybe they're trying to set the price for a new product, or maybe they're considering hiring a new employee and they're trying to decide how much that person should make. In all three situations, the manager is trying to assess the value of an asset. And this brings us to the simple question, what is the value of an asset? Now, if I were to ask this in a classroom setting, I'll typically get a response along the lines of, the value of an asset is what someone else is willing to pay for it. And while this is useful, it's not exactly correct. The value of an asset to an individual or firm is more general than that. It is the gain or the benefit that they receive from owning or consuming that asset. This could be in terms of dollars if it's strictly an investment, but it could also be something like the increased happiness an art collector receives when they purchase a new painting. Economists call this value the utility of the asset, and it typically differs across individuals or firms. This raises a bit of a problem for us. To see why, consider two individuals that are thinking about purchasing a new product. The value of that new product for each person is likely different. The way they assess the value of that new product is also likely different. This is why willingness to pay is such a useful measure of value. By putting the value of an asset in terms of dollars, individual values are put onto the same scale. Moreover, putting value in terms of dollars allows managers to consider things like profit, return on investment, or to set prices or salaries. This is why willingness to pay is typically the first thing that comes to mind when we think about the value of an asset. But it's important to understand that the value of an asset is a little more general than just dollars. Now that we have an understanding of value, let's move on to discuss the differences between a traditional economics class and what we will do in this course. Economists are primarily concerned with efficiency, that is, moving assets from low-valued uses to higher-valued uses. A perfectly efficient economy will have all assets employed in their highest valued uses. There would be no way to improve total efficiency across the economy. In a traditional economics course, we would focus heavily on mathematical models and techniques used to evaluate the short and long-run effects of some policy. The goal of such an analysis would be to recommend policy changes that improve efficiency. Something important to note here is that traditional economics is limited to positive statements, that is, statements of fact resulting from the models themselves. A traditional economic analysis would not include things like moral judgments or intuition. Instead, you would rely on the output of the economic analysis to provide a positive statement. For example, suppose your firm was considering laying off a number of employees. Traditional economic analysis could provide expected profits after laying off the employees or keeping the employees, and you could compare those outcomes. Traditional economics would not include things like the morality of laying off your employees or the manager's intuition behind how this would affect employee morale. In contrast to a traditional economics course, managerial economics is going to be problem-based. We're going to use economic models and methods to evaluate potential solutions, to identify wealth-creating opportunities, and just to make better decisions all around. Just like a perfectly efficient economy has all assets employed in their highest valued uses, a perfectly efficient firm is defined in the same way. A good manager is constantly looking for ways to improve value for the firm. We will not limit ourselves to purely positive economics in this course. Things like personal experience, intuition, strategy, and data analysis can all be brought to bear on the problems we will solve in this class. The goal here is not to become an economist. The goal is to learn to evaluate problems like an economist would. Not so that we could be limited by the economic analysis, but so that we could have an additional frame of reference, a way to structure problems so that we can solve them in a rigorous and formal manner to come up with additional input in decision making. To see how economic theory can be applied to solving problems in business, let's start off with a simple textbook example. Please pause the video as you read through the example and press play to discuss afterward. Now put yourself into the shoes of a manager tasked with preventing this from happening again in the future. How would you go about solving this problem? Once you've come up with potential solutions, the difficulty now lies in comparing those solutions and choosing the one that is best. And that's what this first chapter in the text is really about. Note that these bad decisions were made at the individual level. Therefore, in order to evaluate the effectiveness of potential solutions, the manager must be able to predict how individuals will react to a change in firm policy. One way to accomplish this is through the application of the rational actor paradigm. Traditional economic theory assumes that people act rationally, optimally, and in self-interest. Put simply, the rational actor paradigm assumes that individuals take the information in front of them, carefully calculate the likely outcome of each option, and choose the option that maximizes their value, and this is done completely in self-interest without regard to others. For your first in-class discussion question, please take a moment, pause the video, and consider whether or not this is the correct model of individual behavior. Write down situations where you believe this model would correctly predict individual behavior. Then write down a couple of situations where you believe the model would not work. In our first in-class meeting, I'll call upon students to share their thoughts on this question, so be ready. After this, we will discuss the question as a group. Consider the implications of the rational actor paradigm here. Managers only have two options to change individual behavior. One is to change the incentives that the individual has when they make the decision. The other is to change the information that they use to make the decision. Anything beyond this would not be used by an individual acting under the rational actor paradigm. Now that we know the ways a manager can change individual behavior, let's analyze how to solve a problem. The first thing we need to do is find the root. That is, who is the individual that is making the bad decision? Do they have the information they need to make a good decision? And do they have the incentive they need to make a good decision? While this may sound very simple, it's not always as clear-cut as it would first seem. So make sure you think carefully about these three questions. Next, consider the possible solutions. Could you give the decision maker better information? Something that they would consider that would change the decision that they made and lead to a better outcome for the firm. Oftentimes, a change in incentives can align the decision maker's goals with those of the firm. It could be best just to change the person who makes the decision. Passing a decision up the chain of command is more likely to result in a decision maker being aligned with the goals of the firm. However, this can create other problems that we will talk about later in the class. Finally, evaluate the solutions. Choose the solution that maximizes efficiency for the firm. Now back to the textbook example. Let's apply the method to solving this problem. First, it's clear that senior management made the bad decision. It was the senior manager who decided to overvalue the land and to overbid. The senior manager also followed up by forcing the geologist to increase the valuations even after the dry well was discovered. Senior management did have enough information to make the correct decision here. The geologist informed the senior manager of the true value of the tract. Moreover, the senior manager was aware that one of these wells was dry. So that doesn't appear to be the issue. The problem here is clearly that senior management did not have the incentive to make the right decision. The bonus system was set up to reward managers for increased valuation. As we saw in the problem, valuation can be manipulated. Senior managers were rewarded for acquiring reserves regardless of whether they were profitable or not. Therefore, this structure actually incentivizes management to manipulate the reserve estimate, and that's what we saw happen. This leads to an obvious potential solution. Stop rewarding managers on increased valuation and reward managers for increased profitability instead. Now I want to take a moment here to talk about this method for solving such problems. I've found that a lot of business education is about providing structure for analysis. These simple steps do a good job of setting up the problem so that it can be evaluated in a step-by-step process. I'm sure other processes exist, but this is what we'll use in class. If you have other methods that you would like to discuss with me, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to chat about economics. Let's move on to a new problem. Please pause the video while you review the details. This leads us to our second discussion question for this lecture. In our first in-class meeting, we will discuss this problem and how to go about solving it. Now let's take a look at a slightly different kind of problem. Please pause the video again while you review the details. In this case, we would use our method for analyzing problems to consider why Whole Foods would come up with such a solution. If we assume that Whole Foods hires good managers, then this decision must have been optimal. The subsequent question is then, under what circumstances might this policy actually be optimal? While there are many potential answers, the simplest is litigation. Suppose a Whole Foods employee were to tackle a customer heading for the parking lot because they suspected that customer was stealing something. This could obviously result in a lawsuit. Undoubtedly, Whole Foods will have thought through this policy and weighed the benefits and costs. If the expected costs of potential litigation were greater than the expected losses due to stolen groceries, Whole Foods is doing the right thing here. Another question is, what incentives does this imply for the would-be shoplifters? If a fully rational shoplifter were considering shoplifting from Whole Foods, and they knew that if they get to the door they would not be stopped in the parking lot, this would decrease their probability of being apprehended and increase their likelihood of choosing Whole Foods. This could have some very negative implications if word were to get out that Whole Foods does not apprehend shoplifters. Another question that will sometimes come up when evaluating this type of problem is whether or not Whole Foods is negatively affecting society by having such a policy. In other words, does Whole Foods actually have a social responsibility to stop shoplifters in their stores? And this really opens up an entirely different line of discussion. This leads us to a controversial quote by Milton Friedman. Please take just a moment to read through it. The third discussion question for this lecture is, do you agree with this statement? Why or why not? Typically, we'll have opinions on both sides. Now that we've developed and practiced with a method for evaluating problems, let's dig a bit deeper in how we can assess potential solutions or actions that a firm could take. In its simplest form, business is really just about identifying opportunities to increase wealth, be it wealth of the individual or wealth of the firm. In order to move forward, we really need to have an understanding of how wealth is created. Wealth is created when assets are moved from lower valued uses to higher valued uses. That is, anytime you improve efficiency by moving assets from a low valued use to a high valued use, you have created wealth. Under the rational actor paradigm, all voluntary transactions must create wealth. For example, consider an individual that is selling a used car. If a buyer chooses to come purchase that car from the seller, that voluntary transaction must create wealth. Take a brief moment to consider why this is the case. Pause the video, and we'll continue with the discussion in just a moment. All voluntary transactions must create wealth because otherwise the transactions would not occur. Going back to our example of the used car, the seller would only choose to sell the car if the money he or she is receiving in exchange for the car is greater than the seller's value of the car. On the other side, the buyer would only choose to purchase the car if the value of the car was at least as much as the price the buyer was paying for it. That is, both the buyer and the seller must be better off from this transaction. If this were not the case, one of them would simply walk away and the transaction would not occur. This leads us to a few definitions. The buyer's surplus is defined as the difference between the buyer's value and the transaction price. The seller's surplus is the difference between the transaction price and the seller's value. The total surplus is simply the sum of the buyer's surplus and the seller's surplus. Note that the price must be no greater than the buyer's value and no less than the seller's value. To see this graphically, note the graph on the right. The buyer's value must be greater than the seller's value for there to be room to transact. Somewhere between the buyer's value and the seller's value, they agree upon a price. The buyer's surplus is the difference between the buyer's value and the price. The seller's surplus is the difference between the price and the seller's value. This brings us to our next discussion question. We have discussed why voluntary transactions must create wealth. Try to think of something that we have not included in our discussion that could lead to a voluntary transaction destroying wealth. Write this down and we'll discuss in class. Let's spend a few minutes talking about the ways that government affects voluntary transactions and the creation of wealth. There are many actions taken by the government that can actually destroy wealth. Taxes destroy wealth by preventing some voluntary transactions. This occurs because taxes are added to the price. Therefore, some transactions will be prevented because the tax plus the seller's value is greater than the buyer's value. As a result, there's no room to transact and the transaction does not occur. Subsidies can also destroy wealth. This is because they can incentivize high-valued asset owners to sell when they should not. They can also induce low-valued non-asset owners to buy when they should not. Price floors prevent low-valued sellers from being able to sell. As there are buyers that may be willing to purchase at a price lower than the floor, these wealth-creating transactions could occur but are prevented by the price floor. Price ceilings prevent assets from getting into the hands of the highest valued buyers. All four of these actions reduce wealth-creating transactions. With that said, the government also has many roles that actually increase wealth creation. It's the government's job to enact and enforce laws that require honest trade practices. For example, it is illegal in the United States to lie about a product. That's considered false advertising, and there's a court system that can provide a remedy to those who have been taken advantage of. The government is also responsible for enforcing property rights. If you own something, another person cannot come along and take it from you. This is important for both physical property and intellectual property. In general, the government can increase the number of wealth-creating transactions because buyers and sellers understand that they get to keep the gains from trade. That is, without government protection, this may not be guaranteed, and some people may be too fearful to engage in these transactions. This brings us to the one lesson of business that summarizes the art of management. A good manager should always be on the lookout for low-valued assets that can be moved to higher-valued uses. In other words, the one lesson of business is to make money by identifying unconsummated wealth-creating transactions and finding ways to profitably consummate them. For our last discussion question in this lecture, consider the dangers associated with managerial complacency with respect to wealth creation. Write down your answer and be ready to discuss in class. For our final problem, consider Dell's acquisition of Alienware back in 2006. Assuming that Dell made an optimal decision here, we might ask ourselves how this merger created wealth for them. Considering that this means that low-valued assets were moved to higher-valued uses, Dell likely recognized that their ability to manufacture computers at significantly lower costs could increase the value of the product. Hence, a significant portion of the money that Alienware needed to spend on manufacturing could be moved to a higher-valued use once Dell acquired them. Now, of course, we should recognize that not all mergers create wealth. A mistake that is often made is to assume that just because another company is profitable, that an acquisition would be wealth creating. Remember, in order for wealth to be created, assets need to be moved to higher valued uses. If a firm that's being considered for acquisition is already doing a good job with their assets, it is likely not to be a wealth creating acquisition. Of course, some managers don't necessarily agree and still move forward with an acquisition regardless of whether wealth creation is possible. As a result, we can have mergers that actually destroy wealth, and we've all seen examples of firms suffering after acquiring another firm that was not profitable. This is because there was no room to create wealth. There were no assets to be moved to higher valued uses. You've reached the end of the first lecture for Module 1. Please take a look at the extra problems for this lecture that I'll show you here in a moment. Also make sure to read the associated articles for this lecture and be ready to discuss them in class. Finally, take a look at the end of chapter problems in the textbook associated with chapters 1 and 2. Solutions will be posted on Carmen, and this provides great practice getting ready for quizzes and the exam. One extra problem is parents running behind, and the other is giving green to going green. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.